A man sits alone at a low table with a reed pen in his hand and a blank scroll unrolled in front of him. His name is Matthew. Picture him. Once, he sat at a different table, a tax booth on the road into Capernaum, taking money from his own people for a foreign empire. He was the kind of man mothers warned their children about. You'd have crossed the street to avoid him. And now he is writing the opening line of a book that more human beings will read than any other book ever written. He dips the pen. You can almost hear it scratch the surface. He begins a genealogy. You have to understand what a genealogy meant in his world. It was a legal document. It was a birth certificate and a passport and a crown, all at once. And it followed one unbreakable rule. You traced the fathers. Abraham fathered Isaac. Isaac fathered Jacob. Father to son. Father to son. A straight line of men marching down the centuries toward a king. Women did not belong on a list like this. Not because they didn't matter, but because that is simply not how the document worked. A royal bloodline named the men. So watch what Matthew does. 3 names in, his pen stops, and he writes a woman. Then he does it again, and again. Before he is finished, he will stop 5 times to name a woman in a list that was never supposed to hold even one. And here is the part that should stop you cold. 4 of those 5 women carry a scandal. A prostitute, a foreigner from a nation God's own law had banned, a widow who crept to a man in the dark, and a woman taken by a king in the ugliest abuse of power in the whole Old Testament. These are the names Matthew chose to open the story of Jesus. And when he reaches the greatest king in Israel's history, David himself, he does something that feels almost violent. He lifts his pen to write a certain woman's name, and then he refuses. He will not write it. Instead he writes the name of a dead man. We will come back to that empty space on the scroll, but not yet. Because first you need to see all 5 of them. This is not a list about bloodlines. This is not a list about pedigree. This is not a list about who deserved to be there. This is a list about who God refused to leave out. 5 women, 5 reasons the world would have crossed them off. And one pattern hiding underneath all of them, a pattern that changes who you think this whole story was written for. Let's start with the first name Matthew was never supposed to write. Her name was Tamar, and her story is one most people skip, because it's buried in the middle of Genesis in a chapter that makes everyone uncomfortable. Tamar married into the family of Judah, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, the man whose name the whole nation would carry. She married Judah's oldest son, and then her husband died. In that world, a widow with no son had nothing, no income, no protection, no future, so the law gave her a lifeline. The dead man's brother was supposed to marry her and give her a child, so the family line wouldn't vanish and the widow wouldn't starve. The brother refused to do right by her, and then he died too. Now watch what happens. There was one brother left, the youngest, and Judah, the father, looked at this woman who had buried 2 of his sons, and he got scared. He decided she was bad luck, so he sent her back to her father's house with a promise: wait. And when my youngest is grown, he'll marry you. It was a lie. Judah had no intention of keeping it. He left her a widow in permanent limbo, aging in her father's house, waiting for a wedding that was never coming. You can feel the trap closing around her, can't you? She followed every rule the men around her broke, and they left her to disappear. So Tamar did something desperate. When she heard Judah was traveling to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothes, covered her face with a veil, and sat at the entrance to a town called Enaim. On the road he would travel, Judah saw her, assumed she was a prostitute, and slept with her, not knowing it was the daughter-in-law he had cheated. She asked for his seal, his cord, and his staff as a pledge of payment. He handed him over, and then he went on his way. 3 months later, word reached Judah that his daughter-in-law was pregnant, and Judah, the very man who had wronged her, was furious. He demanded she be dragged out and burned alive. That's when she sent him his own seal, his own cord, his own staff. Do you recognize these? She asked. And Judah stopped. Here's the Hebrew word that turns the whole scene. Judah looks at the evidence in his hands, and he says of Tamar, T-Sadak. It means righteous, in the right, more justified than I am. A patriarch of Israel, standing in front of the whole household, admitting that the woman he tried to burn was more in the right than he was. That's the first woman Matthew wrote into the family tree of the king. Now hold that word, righteous. Because you're going to need it later. Here's what most people miss about this list. It would have been so easy for Matthew to name the safe women. The heroes. Sarah, who mothered a nation. Rebecca, Rachel, the matriarchs whose names every Jewish child could recite. He named none of them. He reached instead for the woman at the town gate in a veil. Which brings us to the second name. And if Tamar made his readers uncomfortable, this one would have made him furious. Her name was Rahab, and the Bible does not soften what she was. She was a prostitute. She was a Canaanite, part of the very people Israel was marching in to conquer. She lived in the wall of the city of Jericho, the first target of the invasion. By every category that mattered to Matthew's readers, she was the enemy. Wrong nation, wrong profession, wrong side of the war. You would have called her the enemy too, and by every rule that mattered, you'd have been right. And when 2 Israelite spies slipped into the city, it was Rahab, the enemy, the outsider, who hid them on her roof under stalks of flax while the king's men pounded on her door. She had heard the stories. She had heard what their God had done at the Red Sea. And somewhere in that pagan city, in a life the world had already written off, she made a decision. She chose their God over her own. She asked the spies for one thing, that when the city fell, her family would be spared. They told her to hang a scarlet cord from her window so the army would know which house to pass over. Now stay with this. The walls of Jericho come down. The city is destroyed, and in the middle of that rubble, one house is left standing, the house with the scarlet cord in the window. Rahab lives. Her whole family lives. And this Canaanite prostitute walks out of the ruins of her old life and straight into the nation of Israel. It made later generations so uncomfortable that they tried to clean her up. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, retells the story and quietly demotes her. In his version, she's an innkeeper. A keeper of a lodging house. Anything but what the text actually says. People have been trying to edit Rahab's resume for 2,000 years. Matthew did the opposite. He wrote her in exactly as she was. Salmon fathered Boaz by Rahab, the prostitute of Jericho, in the bloodline of the Messiah. Name intact. So now you have 2. A woman Judah tried to burn. A woman Israel came to destroy. Both of them written by hand into the ancestry of Jesus, when it would have been so much cleaner to leave them out. Let's stop for 1 second, because I want you to see how strange this already is. 2 women, one that a patriarch of Israel tried to have burned alive, one that Israel itself marched in to destroy. Both of them wrong nation, wrong reputation, wrong side of the story. And both written by name into the family tree of the king. When leaving them out would have been so much easier. If a pattern like that grabs you, the God who keeps writing in the names everyone else would erase, then subscribe before you go any further. Because the next 3 names are where this whole thing breaks open. And keep one question in the back of your mind as we go. Of these 5 women, which one is going to hit you the hardest? Hold that thought. We're about to meet a foreigner the law itself said had no right to be here. Her name was Ruth, and to understand why her name is a scandal, you have to understand where she came from. Ruth was a Moabite, and in the world of the Bible, that word carried a weight it's hard for us to feel today. Moab was a nation born out of shame, an old enemy of Israel, and God's own law, written down in the book of Deuteronomy, said this: no Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord. Down to the 10th generation. Read it plainly. And Ruth is exactly the kind of person the law was built to keep on the outside. And yet here is where her story begins. A famine drives an Israelite family into Moab. The father dies there, then both of his sons die there, and 3 widows are left standing in a foreign field with nothing. An old Israelite woman named Naomi, and her 2 Moabite daughters-in-law. Naomi tells them to go home. Go back to your mothers. She says, go back to your gods. There is nothing left for you with me. One of the young women kisses her goodbye and walks away, and no one blames her. But Ruth would not go. You know the words, even if you don't know where they come from. Where you go I will go. Where you stay I will stay. Your people will be my people. And your God my God. A Moabite woman, saying that to the God who had every legal reason to keep her out. That's the Hebrew word that runs underneath the whole book of Ruth. Hesed. It's usually translated kindness. But it's so much bigger than that. Hesed is loyalty that keeps its promise when nothing in the world is forcing you to. It's the love that stays after the reason to stay is gone. and a foreign widow from a banned nation shows more of it than almost anyone in the Old Testament. So Ruth goes back to Israel with Naomi, a penniless immigrant in a land that had no reason to want her. She works the edges of the fields, bent over in the heat, gathering leftover grain behind the harvesters, taking what the reapers dropped, which is what you did when you had nothing. And the field she happens to work belongs to a man named Boaz, a relative of Naomi's dead husband. A man with the legal right to rescue this family. And here's the part nobody tells you. When Boaz first blesses Ruth, he says she has come to take refuge under the wings of the God of Israel. Wings, covering, shelter for the one who had none. Hold on to that picture, it's going to matter more than you think. In a scene that has made readers blush for 3,000 years. Naomi sends Ruth to the threshing floor at night, to lie down at the feet of Boaz and ask him to cover her, to be her redeemer. It was bold, it was risky, it could have destroyed her. And Boaz, instead of taking advantage, honors her, he marries her, he redeems the whole broken family. And that Moabite woman, the one the law said keep out, gives birth to a son named Obed. Obed fathers Jesse, and Jesse fathers a boy who will keep sheep on the hills of Bethlehem and grow up to be the greatest king Israel ever had. David. Do you see it? The most celebrated king in the nation's history is the great-grandson of a woman his own scriptures said had no place in the assembly. Grace had already broken the rule generations before anyone noticed. But it gets stranger, because the next woman in Matthew's list is connected to that same King David, and her name is the one Matthew refuses to write. Look closely at the words Matthew chose. He does not write, David the father of Solomon by Bathsheba. He writes, David the father of Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. The wife of Uriah. You need to know what stands behind that phrase. David, the king, the man at the height of his power, saw a woman named Bathsheba bathing. And he took her. He was the king. She had no power to refuse a king. And when she turned up pregnant, David tried to cover it. And when the cover-up failed, he had her husband killed. Uriah, a loyal soldier, a foreigner serving Israel faithfully, was placed at the front of a battle and abandoned there to die. So the king could take his wife clean. It is the darkest thing King David ever did. And Matthew puts it right there in the line of the Messiah, but he does it in a way you could easily read straight past. He names the wronged man, Uriah. He keeps the crime visible by keeping the victim's husband on the page. And the woman, he does not shame her with her own name. Stay with me here, because the reason Matthew leaves that name unwritten is not what it looks like. It looks like she's being erased. It is actually the opposite. But to see it, you have to walk with me into the fifth name, the one this whole list has been building toward. So let's go back to that empty space on the scroll, the place where Matthew picked up his pen to write a queen's name, and refused. Here is what most people get wrong about it. They read, the wife of Uriah, and they think Matthew is shaming Bathsheba. Hiding her, reducing her to somebody else's wife. But look again at who actually gets exposed by those words. It isn't her. When Matthew writes, the wife of Uriah, he drags the crime back into the light. He makes you say the victim's husband's name out loud. 2,000 years later, in the family tree of the king, he will not let David's sin be quietly forgotten under a woman's name. The silence around Bathsheba is not an accusation against her. It is an accusation against the most powerful man in the story. Grace covers the one who was wronged, and it refuses to cover the one who did the wrong. Read it that way, and the empty space stops being an insult. It becomes a shield. Matthew protects her by silence, and indicts a king by name. That is not erasing a woman. That is defending one. 4 women now. Tamar, whom a patriarch called righteous. Rahab, whom an army passed over. Ruth, whom the law tried to keep out. And the wife of Uriah, whom a king wronged and scripture would not let anyone forget. 4 women the world had every reason to leave off the list, and Matthew wrote every single one of them in. And then he comes to the 5th. And he does the most daring thing in the entire genealogy. Her name was Mary. She was young, likely a teenager. She lived in Nazareth, a town so unremarkable that people used to joke nothing good could come out of it. And she was pregnant before she was married. You already know what a town like that would have assumed about a girl like that. The whispers would have started before the pregnancy even showed. In her world, that was the kind of thing that could get a woman stoned. So look at the company Matthew has placed her in. A woman accused of playing the harlot. A woman who actually was one. A foreigner, a victim of a king. And now a young girl the whole town assumed had sinned. Matthew set Mary at the climax of a line built entirely out of women the world had already judged. But watch what he does with the words themselves, because this is the moment he breaks his own pattern for good. For 40 generations he has written the same phrase. This one fathered that one. Fathered, 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 male name after male name. Marching down the page, and then he reaches the end. And the machine stops. He does not write, Joseph the father of Jesus. He writes, Joseph the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born. Of whom, in the Greek, that little phrase, h's, is feminine. Singular, it points at one person. Not Joseph, her. Jesus is born of her. With a single word, Matthew quietly announces that this child has no human father in the line at all, and hands the whole story of the king. At its very last step, to a woman. Now stand back and look at the whole thing at once. Because the pattern that's been hiding under all 5 names finally comes into focus. Every one of these women arrived with something the world would use to disqualify her. A scandal, a nationality, a wound, a reputation, and not one of those things kept her out. Matthew didn't include these women in spite of their stories. He included them because of what their stories reveal about the God at the end of the line. Let me put it the plainest way I can. Think of your own family. Almost every family has one, the name that gets lowered to a whisper at the dinner table. The relative you'd leave off the Christmas card. The divorce. The scandal. The one who brought shame. We spend our whole lives editing those names down, hoping no one asks. And here is Matthew, opening the story of God with us. Doing the exact opposite. He takes the names you would whisper, and he writes them into the headline. She was not chosen because she was flawless. She was not chosen because she fit. She was not chosen because the rules allowed it. She was chosen because the God at the end of this genealogy has never once been in the business of leaving people out. That is the pattern. That is why Matthew broke every rule of his craft to name these 5. He was telling you, before Jesus speaks a single word, exactly what kind of king had arrived, and exactly who this good news was going to be for. It was going to be for the Tamars, the Rahabs, the Ruths, for the wronged, the whispered about, the ones kept outside the door. It was going to be for you. So before you go, let me leave you with 3 things to carry out of this. The first is this: Matthew named these women on purpose. This was not an accident. And it was not sentiment. In his world, a royal genealogy named the fathers. A woman's name appearing on a list like this was so unusual that it could only mean one thing. Intent. Matthew wanted you to stop on Tamar. He wanted you to stumble over Rahab. He chose every one of these names knowing exactly how uncomfortable they would make his readers. 5 women, 4 scandals, 1 deliberate act of a man who refused to write a clean list. The second is closer to home. Whatever it is you carry, the thing you assume disqualifies you. The chapter of your story you hope no one brings up, look at this list again. That disqualification is not the end of your place in the story. Every woman on this page had a reason the world would have used to shut the door. And every one of them ended up in the family tree of God. What you think keeps you out is the very thing this line was built to answer. And the third is the one I most want you to hold on to. The God at the end of this genealogy specializes in exactly one thing, writing in the names that everyone else erased. He did it with a woman a patriarch tried to burn. He did it with a prostitute in a condemned city. He did it with a foreigner the law shut out. With a woman a king wronged. And with a frightened teenage girl the whole town had already judged. He has been doing it since the first line of the first gospel. And he has not stopped. So here is my question for you. And I really do want your answer. Of these 5, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, the wife of Uriah, or Mary, which one hit you the hardest? Which name did you feel in your chest? Tell me below. I read them. Because in the end, that genealogy was never a list of the worthy. Matthew could have written one of those. It would have been shorter and cleaner, and no one would have remembered it. Instead, he gave us a list of the loved. And he opened the story of Jesus by telling you, in 5 names, that there has never been a version of this good news that was not, from the very first line, meant for you.